I'm delighted to welcome our speaker tonight, Dr Diletta De Cristofaro. She is a research fellow funded by the Wellcome Trust at Northumbria University. She writes about contemporary culture, crises, and the politics of time. Tonight, she poses the question, are we in a sleep crisis? Over to you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much to Kay for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really delighted to be here at the Lit and Phil, albeit, of course, virtually. So tonight's talk draws on Writing Sleep, which is a research project I lead at Northumbria University, and as Kay said, which is funded by the Wellcome Trust. So the project explores representations of sleep in contemporary writings across fiction, non-fiction, and digital culture. And in particular, the project investigates cultural engagements with this idea of a sleep crisis, which obviously I'm going to be talking about more in detail in a moment, but it's basically this idea that contemporary society is chronically sleep deprived. If you're interested in the topic and you'd like to keep up to date with project's news, events, and publications, you can find the project on both Twitter and Facebook. The handles are on the slide. So tonight, I'll be taking you on a tour of some contemporary representations of sleep to ask, what does culture have to say about this idea that in the 21st century, we don't sleep as much as we should? Are we in a sleep crisis? So first things first, though, before we venture into these contemporary representations of sleep, a little bit about this notion of a sleep crisis. So news headlines like those on the slide should give you a good idea of what the sleep crisis is. So other kind of ideas, synonyms for this notion are sleep debt or societal insomnia. You might have perhaps seen these terms rather than sleep crisis. But they all denote really the same kind of idea, the same kind of phenomenon, which is, again, this notion that contemporary society is chronically sleep deprived, that sleep disorders are on the rise, and that this, in turn, brings about a series of other health issues, such as increased risk of Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease, depression, and so on. So this is why, within this type of analysis, poor sleep and lack of sleep are seen as a public health crisis. So a public health emergency that spans all age brackets. So one of the examples on the slide is a headline that refers to children specifically, but as I said, it really does span all age brackets. And of course, and we were just talking about it with Kay just before we started the meeting for everybody else, this type of news coverage has received new impetus from the situation in which we're living, so the coronavirus crisis. So people are struggling with poor sleep. You might be one of these people because, of course, of the unprecedented and anxiety-inducing situation we all face. And so articles providing top tips for a good night's sleep to exhausted nations have multiplied. And what's interesting is that often this type of news coverage frames poor sleep as a risk factor in COVID itself. So in other words, if you're sleep deprived, this kind of news coverage goes, then you're more at risk of contracting severe cases of COVID. So again, in this case too, we find this kind of widespread idea of poor sleep as a public health crisis, something that puts our overall health at risk. Now, of course, we know that all media love a good crisis and the kind of sensationalist headlines these crises provide. So the Sun's headline on the slide is a particularly good example of sensationalism, as indicated by the words nightmare and kill in all caps. Now, hardly surprisingly, medical and sociological analysis of the sleep crisis are a little bit more nuanced. And indeed, there really isn't substantial agreement in academic research on whether sleep is in fact in crisis in the contemporary moment. So some research and data do support the hypothesis of a contemporary sleep crisis. So on the slide, you can see a few stats and figures from the Sleep Council, which is a UK-based organisation. So their latest Great British Bedtime Report from 2017 found that almost 3/4, so 74% of Brits, sleep less than 7 hours per night. And in total, their homepage reports that 40% of people in the UK struggle with sleep issues. Similarly, in the US, the National Sleep Foundation has found in its latest Sleep in America poll from 2020 that Americans feel sleepy 3 days a week, which impacts their daily activities, lives, moods, productivity, and so forth. And beyond these polls, surveys, data, both in the UK and in the US, there's a host of research from several areas of sleep studies arguing that we are indeed in a sleep crisis. I'm just going to give you a flavor of these arguments that claim indeed that we are in a sleep crisis. So Till Runnenberg, for instance, who is a professor of chronobiology, claims that people are getting 1 to 2 hours less sleep each night than their ancestors did 50 to 100 years ago, and that sleep pathologies are approaching epidemic levels, affecting an estimated 70 million people in the United States alone. And Runnenberg's research is particularly concerned with this idea of social jet lag. So the sleep deprivation produced by the gap between the clock dictated by society, so for instance, patterns of work, and one's own internal clock, one's own preferences in terms of when we'd naturally wake up and go to sleep in the absence of societal pressures. Another prominent advocate of a sleep crisis is Charles Czeisler, who is professor of sleep medicine at Harvard. Czeisler's research focuses in particular on the impact that electric light has had on our sleep. So he writes, technology, and by technology he actually means electric light, has effectively decoupled us from the natural 24-hour day to which our bodies evolved, driving us to go to bed later. And we use caffeine in the morning to rise as early as we ever did, putting the squeeze on sleep. So he argues that the increase in light consumption over the past century has paralleled the rise in sleep deficiency. And in the piece that I'm quoting here, Czeisler specifically mentions how LED lights, so those used in TVs, smartphones, laptops, are particularly rich in blue light, which is more disruptive to circadian rhythms and thus to sleep. So I'm sure you're all familiar with that advice to put your phones away 2 hours before going to bed. Well, this is the type of research where that advice actually comes from. And finally, and again, this is just to give you a kind of flavor of the different types of arguments that support this thesis of a sleep crisis, there's a more sociological argument around the nature of our 24-hour society, which of course, by virtue of its being literally active around the clock, seems to be conspiring to demote sleep in our list of priorities. And this is a quotation from Lockley and Foster's short introduction to sleep. But, as I was saying, the existence of a sleep crisis is contested. So here's, for instance, Simon J. Williams, who is a sociologist of sleep, providing a nuanced summary of why we might want to complicate this idea of a sleep crisis. So William writes that individual sleep needs are known to vary, and the problem of self-defined sleep deficit or deprivation may be as much a product of perception as it is of actual time spent asleep. So you're probably familiar with that notion that insomniacs tend to overestimate the time that they spend awake each night. And so the same kind of idea could be applied to societal insomnia. So we're all overestimating our sleep deprivation when we talk about a sleep crisis. That's what this argument claims. Similarly, Jim Horn, who is a sleep neuroscientist, argues against the kind of data that I was talking about a few moments ago, arguing that actually sleep debt is overstated, as the great majority of us have sufficient sleep, especially as our 7-hour average sleep has changed little over the last century. And this argument about how little sleep patterns have changed over the previous century is particularly important, because it points to the most typical argument aimed at complicating this thesis of a sleep crisis in the 21st century. And this is the kind of historical, cultural argument that preoccupations with society's lack of sleep are nothing new. So in Becoming Insomniac, for instance, Lee Scrivener actually shows how a century ago, people thought that there was an insomnia epidemic just as they do today, and ultimately argues for insomnia as a byproduct of technological modernity. So clearly then, the sleep crisis is a very contested notion in studies of contemporary sleep practices. And yet, irrespective of whether this crisis is actual or just a matter of perception, this discourse of contemporary society as chronically sleep-deprived has become one of the main ways we talk about sleep and indeed ourselves in our present, as reflected, for instance, in Google searches. Now, what you see on the slide, which is this query, why am I, which Google autocompletes with always tired and so tired, is actually taken in incognito mode. So these autocomplete suggestions are not based on my own search history. It's the Google God that decides that this is what people may be looking for when they search, why am I? As I'm sure you'll all agree, why am I is a very kind of broad general query. So these autocomplete suggestions are quite intriguing. They seem to suggest that being tired, sleep deprived is really quintessential to our existence, as well as apparently being really, really cold, as the final autocomplete suggestion shows us. So we seem to be defined by our own tiredness. And indeed, as I will talk about in the rest of this talk, this sense of a pervasive sleep crisis has really come to dominate cultural production as well. And the premise behind my research is that cultural production helps illuminate, clarify what is at stake in this widespread belief that we are in a sleep crisis, that we're not sleeping as much as we should. A belief that, as I said, isn't fully supported by medical, sociological, and historical research, but that nevertheless is very much at the core of our society. So an example of contemporary cultural production engaging with this notion of the sleep crisis is the burgeoning genre of speculative fictions that imagine sleepless futures. So the titles that you see on the slide are all examples of a specific plot device within this genre, which is future insomnia epidemics or pandemics. And I'm sure you'll be all delighted to hear that in the midst of our COVID-19 crisis. Now, obviously, science and speculative fiction are never really about the futures that these texts depict. Instead, their imagined futures serve to reflect upon the present in which these texts are written. So these novels all depict more or less near future worlds ravaged by pandemics of insomnia to explore the fear that our real world present is plagued by a creeping sleep crisis. And so I'd like to start our tour of contemporary cultural representations of sleep and the sleep crisis precisely from one of these novels, Sleep Donation by American author Karen Russell. So this novel was originally published in 2014 as a digital-only format, but in 2020 it was actually republished in paperback with some new illustrations that you'll see on the slides in a moment. And I really do recommend this novel. It's really a fantastic read. So Sleep Donation imagines a very near future. There isn't really much difference between our present and what Russell imagines, except, of course, for this pandemic of total sleep loss called terminal insomnia, which leaves thousands of people incapable of sleeping until they die from this constant hypervigilance. So typical medications that we now use for treating insomnia don't work on this disease. And the only way people affected by terminal insomnia can be saved is through sleep transfusions, hence the novel's title. Now, the good news is that one sleep transfusion is generally enough for these patients' circadian rhythms to reset. So they start sleeping normally again. But of course, the waiting list for these transfusions is long. There are not enough donors. And what's more, sleep donations are at risk of being compromised by incredibly contagious nightmares, which leads to another type of insomnia whereby people do everything they can to not fall asleep, to stay awake, because they don't want to have these horrific nightmares they've contracted through sleep transfusions. Now, that Russell's near future epidemic of terminal insomnia is making literal current anxieties around the sleep crisis is quite evident. So that this pandemic and the situation surrounding it is more than once described as a sleep crisis in the novel. And when news about terminal insomnia begin to appear, people actually initially dismiss the disease as an exaggeration of a universal contemporary condition, as nobody has enough sleep in this society that closely resembles our own. So Russell writes, many people dismiss the disorder as an exaggeration of a universal American condition. Who was sleeping enough? Nobody. The crisis seemed like more TV hyperbole designed to keep us glued to our screens, watching mattress commercials. And Russell here is talking about an American condition specifically, because at this stage in the narrative, the insomnia epidemic seems to be limited just to the United States, but then it spreads to the rest of the world. And while the causes of this epidemic remain unclear throughout the novel, speculations around this fictional sleep crisis are along the same lines as the causes speculated to be behind the sleep crisis of our own society. So experts in the novel think that, and I'm quoting, sleep has been chased off the globe by our 24-hour news cycle, our polluted skies and crops and waterways, the bald eyeballs of our glowing devices. We Americans are sitting in an electric chair that we engineered. So the terminal insomnia in the novel, scientists speculate, has something to do with the nature of a 24/7 society, an explanation that mirrors the arguments I was describing a few slides ago. And equally, experts speculate terminal insomnia may have been brought about by the glowing devices that surround us. So basically here, the pundits in the novel are talking about the impact of the light of these devices on our sleep and our circadian rhythms, which, as I mentioned earlier on in my talk, is exactly, again, what some sleep scientists actually argue about our contemporary sleep practices. But sleep donation does more than just drawing on scientific research about the sleep crisis and taking this nation to the extreme by imagining this kind of total epidemic of total insomnia. Rather, Russell's novel uses the image of non-sleeping bodies to communicate a number of anxieties about 21st century life, which in turn illuminates what might be at stake in this widespread perception of a sleep crisis in our society. So in his analysis of 24/7 Capitalism and Society and Sleep, Jonathan Crary, who's a heart historian, writes that sleep will always collide with the demands of a 24/7 universe. The huge portion of our lives that we spend asleep, freed from a morass of stimulated needs, subsists as one of the great human affronts to the voraciousness of contemporary capitalism. So when we sleep, this argument goes, we don't work and we don't consume, or at least, since there is, of course, quite a thriving market of sleep aids and other related products, we don't consume as much as we do when we're awake. But what Russell imagines is precisely the fall of sleep as this kind of last defense against the voraciousness of contemporary capitalism. So due to its extreme scarcity within the novel's world, sleep becomes an incredibly invaluable commodity. So it becomes part, effectively, of the capitalist system, which opens up new and disturbing avenues for exploitation. So the book begins with this idea that sleep donations are administered by what looks like a benevolent non-profit organization of volunteers, the Slumber Corps, which pledges to get sleep to every insomniac for as long as her or his need persists, and all for free. But it soon emerges that the organization is actually behind a global black market. So as the protagonist puts it, sleep donations are a Ponzi scheme. So sleep is freely given, donated by people who hope to make a difference and help society overcome this deadly pandemic. But in reality, their donations serve to reap profits for the head of this organization, who turns sleep donations into treatments available only to those who can afford it. So the sleep crisis scenario imagined by Russell is straight out of the disaster capitalism playbook. So it turns a crisis into an opportunity for profit. Now, the premise behind this quotation on the slide by Crary is that there's a gap, right, between the demands of a 24/7 system and our body's needs. Simply put, we cannot work while we sleep, and we need sleep to work. And this gap seems so far impossible to close, despite ongoing, but again, so far not particularly fruitful research, especially in the military, on drugs that could promote non-stop performance on human beings. So performance with no need to sleep. So ultimately, we're not the perfect workers for a 24/7 system because we're not 24/7 productivity machines, at least not yet. But what Russell's sleep donors, and you can see here an image of a sleep donation, what these sleep donors do is that they in fact work in their sleep. So again, we see how in this novel, sleep as this kind of last defense against the voracious capitalism that takes over all aspects of our life, of our lives, has fallen. So just as they do in their daily jobs, sleep donors produce value while they sleep through their sleep donations. And what's more, this value is produced through entirely free labor, because sleep donors, as the term suggests, are volunteers. And even those who draw their sleep are often volunteers. And significantly, the most exploited worker / sleep donor of all is a baby A, whom you see on the slide during a sleep donation. Baby A, as there are some newspapers in that image on the slide, so you might just make out that the headlines say baby A saves the night. And she saves the night because she is the world's only universal sleep donor. So her sleep can universally cure people affected by terminal insomnia. And this entails she's subjected to constant sleep draws. And while, of course, the Slumber Corps repeatedly assure her family that these donations are safe, this is the same organization that is profiting from a black market on which baby A's sleep donations fetch the highest price. So not exactly trustworthy. But it's not just baby A's who's been horribly exploited in Russell's novel, though of course, because she's a baby, her example is particularly poignant. On the slide, you can see a few excerpts from the novel about another sleep donor, Jeremy, who actually also works for the Slumber Corps. So Jeremy not only works the equivalent of 3 jobs at a very low salary, but also compounds his obscene work hours with sleep donations. And so half a year of Jeremy's life has gone in sleep donations alone. So if you add this half a year to his work time, how many hours does Jeremy actually have for himself? How many hours of his life do not belong in one way or another to his employer? And yet, talking about the many hours of sleep he's donated, which he says far in excess of the legal limits, Jeremy's very proud. He grins, even though his body is clearly suffering from this excessive labor. As Russell writes, if you give beyond the body's natural limits, you'll suffer the same consequences of sleep loss that afflict our insomniacs: cognitive impairment, physiological exhaustion, collapse. Jeremy stumbles around the trailer like a zombie some mornings, zonked from a 9-hour draw. So Jeremy is quite literally being sucked dry by his employer. Even his sleep belongs to his employer. Even his sleep is work. So through this extreme version of the sleep crisis, Russell illuminates fears about the capitalist logic of profit taking over every aspect of our lives, including our sleep, which so far has offered some kind of respite from production and consumption. So the sleep crisis in this novel suggests one of the reasons why we find this notion of a sleep crisis so appealing, even though it's quite a contested notion, is that the image of our society as chronically sleep-deprived helps us express our anxieties, our worries, our fears about the nature of contemporary capitalism and its work practices. And I'll return to this idea throughout my exploration of contemporary representations of sleep. So another slightly older example of science fiction about this kind of end of sleep is Nancy Kress's Sleepless trilogy, which was published between 1991 and 1996. And this trilogy imagines a different future end of sleep, this time not at the hands of an insomnia pandemic, but at the hands of genetic engineering. So in Kress's future, some human beings have been genetically engineered so that they don't need to sleep at all. They're called sleepless, and they are incredibly gifted and intelligent. So sleeplessness is a choice in this world. And the sleep crisis is basically an opportunity rather than something incredibly damaging. Or at least it seems this way at the beginning of the trilogy. Things get a little bit more complicated as we read on, but I won't tell you too much in case you'd like to read the novels in the future. And here's the question that Kress's trilogy invites us to ponder. So if it was possible for you to need no sleep at all, with no detriment whatsoever to your health, would you do it? And it might seem like an idle question, and to an extent it is, although again, as I mentioned, there is ongoing research in the military attempting to create this kind of 24/7 soldier who could go on without sleep for up to a week. But even if potentially idle, this question that Kress's trilogy invites us to ponder makes us consider what our attitudes to sleep, and indeed society's attitudes to sleep might be. Attitudes that, of course, again, can help us explain this widespread sense of a sleep crisis in the contemporary moment. So do we consider, or the society pressures us to consider, sleep as a kind of necessary waste of time, something that we would gladly do away with if we could, to focus on activities that we might consider more worthwhile? And if so, what are these activities? Or do we, and again, the society that we live in, relish sleep, the pause, the relaxation it grants us in our lives, and would therefore never give it up, even if we could? The father of one of the first children engineered to be sleepless clearly holds the former view. He explains his decision to pay a lot of money to genetically modify his child to need no sleep at all as follows. Do you know how much more I could have accomplished if I hadn't had to sleep all my life? So sleep to him is just lost time, wasted life, something that stands in the way of accomplishment, of productivity, of work. This father wishes his daughter to be sleepless, not because this would give her more time to, say, enjoy life, hobbies, her families, relationships, but rather because this would allow her to be more productive, to accomplish more. So this father, and by extension the society, of course, imagined by Kress, which comes up with this plan to genetically engineer a sleepless future, embodies this harmful but sadly quite pervasive view that to be successful, one has to sleep as little as possible, that to sleep is a kind of indulgence, a kind of guilty pleasure. And this isn't, of course, necessarily a particularly new view. So if you go back to Thomas Edison, for instance, the American inventor, he was renowned for saying that he only slept 4 to 5 hours per night, and for viewing sleep as a waste of time and a loss of opportunity. And I'm sure you could think of several other figures that propounded the same worldview. Thatcher, for instance. A more contemporary example is Elon Musk, Tesla CEO, whose workaholism and extreme sleep deprivation is really a kind of cornerstone of his mythology, of the way he narrates his success. So Kress is really exploring, denouncing this worldview when she imagines in her trilogy the dire consequences for humanity of genetically engineered sleeplessness. And this, as I was saying, this view is quite pervasive, right? So in his book, The Politics of Sleep, Williams calls it the dominant sleep negative agenda of our society. An agenda characterized by the devaluation of sleep and the privileging, he argues, of waking life. So in this view, embedded in our work culture and hyper-connected world, there is no time for sleep. Sleep is for losers. And so subjected to this dominant view and its pressures, it's hardly surprising that people feel then that we are in a sleep crisis, that we live in a society that actively encourages us to be always on and actually discourages us from sleeping, from resting. So in this type of worldview, insomnia, to put it with the protagonist of Jenny Offill's Weather, which is a very recent novel published in 2020, insomnia is often seen as a badge of honor in our world. And this dominant sleep negative agenda of our society is dramatized in quite an interesting way in a 2006 movie, Click, with Adam Sandler. Some of you might be familiar with. So the movie opens with the protagonist, Michael, a workaholic architect played by Adam Sandler, asleep on a sofa in the early morning, surrounded by his work. So he's clearly stayed up late to work, he's desperately trying to be promoted, and has fallen asleep without meaning to. The demands of Michael's jobs are becoming more and more relentless. He's exhausted, he's finding less and less time, not just to sleep, but also to be with his family. And the movie's title refers to a remote that Michael is given by a mysterious scientist / godlike figure, a remote which seems to be the answer to Michael's time conundrum. So the remote, it turns out, can control Michael's universe, specifically time. It can pause, rewind, delete, skip, and fast forward through Michael's life as much as he wants. And as you might be able to see from the image on the slide, Michael has his finger firmly on the remote button, skip. Because Michael mostly uses the skip function in the movie to get ahead with work, running towards this promotion that seems to constantly elude him, to be constantly delayed, and skips effectively time that he sees as worthless, useless when it comes to fulfilling his work goals. So he ruthlessly skips through leisure time, family time, and of course, sleep, only then to realize that he has missed very important events in the lives of those he loves, and that his own life is, of course, falling apart. So if texts like Cress's trilogy or the movie Click denounce this kind of dominant worldview that devalues sleep by showing its negative impacts on people, other contemporary texts actually embodies another kind of agenda, which is not dominant, but it's growing, and it's the sleep positive agenda. So this agenda champions sleep and highlights the costs and consequences of poor sleep on our society. So in other words, this agenda effectively seeks to combat the sleep crisis. So the sleep positive agenda is represented by those sleep experts and organizations I was mentioning at the beginning of my talk, but also self-help literature on sleep, and of course, a burgeoning sleep industry, which includes apps. So briefly, I'd like to focus on self-help and sleep apps to tease out elements of their attitudes towards sleep that help us further understand what is at stake in this idea of a sleep crisis. So self-help and apps often frame the discourse around sleep as around productivity. So the app that you see on the slide, SIDS, whose slogan is Sleep Nap Focus, is a good example because the main message here is if you can't be a productive, focused worker if you don't sleep, so we're going to teach you how to sleep, which is pretty much the same idea as the message on the self-help book on the slide. So we're going to teach you how to get the sleep you need to succeed. So it's a very kind of instrumentalist view of sleep as a tool for success, for productivity, for focusing, for self-improvement, rather than seeing sleep, for instance, as a kind of restorative time, a time for pausing, or even simply a physical need, which of course it is. And so in many ways, this kind of instrumentalist view of sleep is the other side of the view held by the father in Nancy Kress's trilogy. If we can't engineer sleep out of ourselves in order to accomplish more, then we might as well sleep, but only as much as we need to ensure we succeed. And what I find interesting about this idea of sleep as a tool for productivity is that, first of all, it conceives of sleep and of the sleep crisis as a source of economic damage. So there's plenty of news pieces like those, like the one on the slide, which expound the view that poor sleep needs to be fixed in contemporary society, not just because of health reasons, but because it actually makes workers less productive, and thus it's a liability for profit. But also what this conception of sleep signals is the broader kind of context in which health and well-being become very much a personal responsibility. So the tweet that you see on the slide is a parody tweet, but it basically suggests that this type of idea decouples really individual well-being from the context in which the individual lives and works. So rather than seeing, for instance, lack of sleep or poor sleep as produced by this context by, say, anxieties about precarity, sleep, and specifically here, the power nap, which is often portrayed in self-help as this kind of tool, secret tool for productivity, sleep becomes a kind of quick fix to precarity itself. And I think we need instead narratives that really embed this widespread sense that we are in a sleep crisis in the context in which we live. So narratives that tease out how the context in which we live produce this sense of a sleep crisis. So I'll just leave you with 3 potential examples of this type of narratives on the slide. So there are 2 novels, There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job and Seasonal Associate, which both explore burnout and sleep issues in the contemporary precarious workplace. And then there's an Instagram post by the Nap Ministry, which is an activist organization that celebrates the power of naps and highlights the links between hustle culture, so this kind of culture that celebrates productivity at all costs, and white supremacy. So thanks very much for listening, and I'm obviously very happy to take questions if you have any.
Are there any comments from the audience?
Yes, I just say I found that very interesting. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear.
Very much, yes.
Thank
Very
you.
interesting. Further research.
One question's just come up on the chat facility. Let me just find it. Is there a view that the virus has been beneficial by giving people more time to sleep?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So yes, there is some research. So on the one hand, there is some research that actually talks a lot about how our sleep has become more disturbed because of the virus, effectively, and because of the kind of situation in which we live. So specifically like worries. There's a lot of research about dreams, for instance, changing a lot because of the virus. So in some cases, reflecting, for instance, back to us the situation in which we live. But yes, there's also some research that, especially for people that whose internal clock might actually be very different from the clock that society kind of imposes on them. So say people that love, for instance, to stay up very late and wake up quite late as well. For those people, the virus, because of course many people have been working from home, has been beneficial because they can make their own rhythms a little bit more. So yes, there is some research of that as well.
I've read reports that people during the pandemic have had very strange or vivid dreams. Is there any research going on into dreaming?
Yes, absolutely. So there are also colleagues at Northumbria that are working on that at the Sleep Centre. There's some in London as well. So yes, I don't know whether they're still collecting dreams, but I know that there was a research centre in London specifically, a project which was called Lockdown Dreams. So if you Google, you'll find it. And they were actually collecting dreams from the pandemic and analysing them. And they are experts in psychoanalysis, so they work within that kind of tradition. I think there are colleagues at Swansea as well, working on those kind of questions. So yes, there's a lot of research in terms of dreams. So
yes, thank you.
We're very much We're very much in this in a time of listening to the experts, to the all our policies and so on. We have to listen to the scientific experts first, and it would be helpful because you've slightly confused me. I found it very interesting too. Lots of food for thought. But I would like to know whether or not I do need to have more sleep, or whether it's just a.
I think that the question is. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I ploughed through a pretty tricky scientific book about sleep fairly recently. I can't remember what it was called now, but it seemed to be suggesting that I do need sleep. I do need more sleep. And in fact, it will kill me if I don't, or I'll certainly live less long if I don't sleep. I mean, that's the thing I'd like to be clear about. Can I just say, don't worry about it too much, Jamie, or should I sleep?
Well, obviously, I'm not a sleep scientist in the kind of medical field, so I can't obviously advise you on that. But from my own research, I know that, I mean, probably the main issue that somebody who works in that field would ask you is, do you feel tired? Because if you feel okay, then you're probably sleeping enough, basically. But yes, obviously, there is a lot of research that if you sleep, 3 to 4 hours a night, then that might be a problem for your health. But as long as, basically, the kind of idea is that, when we hear this kind of magic number of 8 hours per night, that's a little bit of a made up number. In other words, it's not necessarily the best guide, because all of us have kind of different sleep needs. So I guess how you feel might give you an indication of whether you need to sleep more or not.
Somebody asks, where do you think your research will end up, And have you an example of something that has surprised you?
Next, so at the moment I'm working a lot on fiction. Next, I'll be working a little bit more on apps and kind of wearable technologies around sleep. And so how, especially how these technologies are marketed to us. So there's a lot of, websites, blogs, etc., social media. So the kind of, rhetoric that they use to sell to us these devices. So what does the kind of promotional material tell us about our attitudes to sleep? In terms of surprising, that's an interesting one. I guess I was surprised. So my previous work was on the idea of apocalypse. So I wrote a book about the Contemporary Post-Apocalyptic Novel, and throughout that research, I never really had encountered this idea of insomnia pandemics in fictions. And then when I started this project, I actually found so many novels about insomnia pandemics. And I guess that I was surprised that that was the case. It just didn't really occur to me that that might be a kind of trope that, would fascinate writers so much. But it does. There are so many writers that write about insomnia pandemics. And that I think is worthy of more investigation.
It was interesting when you were saying there's research going on, especially in the military about people, going 24/7 and not needing sleep. I'm just wondering what your views are on that. Whether you think we're going towards that, and if we did, would there be problems? Would we actually then not go to bed and experience things that I actually look forward to going to bed, and other things go on in the bed, like sex, like reading books. Would all those things disappear and we not have time for them?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, at the moment, that research has been going on for a while, and it doesn't seem to, or at least, the what's public information about it, I suppose, doesn't seem to be going that far. But it's interesting because I think that at one point they were working on sparrows, if I'm not mistaken, because sparrows they could give them indications on how, again, this kind of possibility of producing this 24/7 human being could be done. It's an interesting one. I mean, obviously, I personally think that because there is a lot of interest around the kind of negative effects that poor sleep has on our health, I don't think that kind of research has that much of a future, possibly, because there is too much research going on the damages that kind of lack of sleep could do to our bodies. So my sense is that hopefully it won't go that far.
Do you think there might be a connection between the sleep crisis and contemporary views of death and dying?
What do you mean with that? As in, is that your question, Kay? Sorry.
That comes from Helen.
Okay.
Expand on that, maybe?
Helen, do you want to say a little bit more? Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I was just struck, even I think it was Bill, the last person, who said, I look forward to going to bed. Some people, that whole connection between sleep and death and unconsciousness. And I just wondered if you thought, it just occurred to me, it's not something I've thought through, but it just occurred to me as well, if there is any connection in terms of avoidance of, fear of, obsession with, and it's something else that means we're not talking about death. Yeah,
that's a really interesting question. There are some kind of memoirs where this kind of association between sleep and death comes up. So there's a lot of insomnia memoirs around. This is another kind of genre that is quite flourishing at the moment. And in those kind of memoirs, there's often this sense that, sleep as a kind of source of anxiety in many ways, because again, it's associated with death, as you say. I don't know if we could take that to mean that this kind of fear of death might be one of the reasons why, for instance, in general society, might be sleep deprived. But there is definitely a kind of individual associations between these two ideas. So you're absolutely right in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, if there are no more questions or comments, I'd just like to thank you so much for a fascinating insight into your research. And I know that you've, in some senses, barely started. So we look forward to the day when you can come back to the Lit and Phil in person, in the building, and talk to us again about your continuing research. That would be fantastic. Thank you so much.
I would love that. Thank you so much again for the invitation and for all your questions. I just saw that Michael actually put a question to me in the chat. I'm curious to know if you think we could learn from early modern sleepers as illuminated in the work of Sasha Handley, and should be thinking about changing our sleep patterns and aiming to have multiple sleeps. That's a really good question. So Sasha, yes, has written a lot about early modern sleep, and there's a lot of research going on in terms of whether people before basically the Industrial Revolution had a kind of sorry, I'm missing my words now, but basically they used to have multiple sleeps, as Michael writes. So in other words, they used to go to bed, then wake up in the middle of the night, have a couple of hours in which they could pray, have sex, or do some work, etc., and then go to sleep again. So some people actually naturally, so this is another thing that has emerged from research during COVID. Some people naturally actually have reverted to that kind of sleep pattern. But I guess that the question with that is, our works normally don't really allow us to do that, right? So I think it's a problem of whether society and kind of patterns of work can adapt to our patterns of sleep if they are indeed polyphasic. But that is a really interesting question, yes. Thank you.
Can I just comment? Yes, that's interesting. It would be nice to know what pre-industrialized societies, what their sleep pattern is like. And I worked for the NHS for many years, and it is known that people that do shift work over the years, they do die longer. They do die earlier, which is why NHS pensions sort of kick in, and fire brigade, police at 55 to compensate for that probably early death. And we do live in a society where we, maybe too much sleep, or you're lazy, that sort of thing we were brought up with. But I've just retired now, and as well as working in the health service, I've got an interest in complementary therapies. So I know, from that point of view, I do think that sleep is vital for healing, for recuperation. And so since I've retired, I'm sleeping 10, 12 hours a night.
That's great.
And I love it, and I feel so well, and I think, well, no, I'm not going to feel lazy, because obviously my body needs it, and maybe I'm lucky that I can do that. But that's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, no, that's lovely. Yes, I mean, on kind of pre-industrial sleep, there's a book by Roger Urquhart called At Night's Close or something like that. So if you Google that, you will find it. And it's a very kind of accessible work on basically how we used to sleep before the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, I recommend that.
Thank you, Diletta. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Diletta, for our fascinating evening. Thank you, our audience, for joining us, and thanks to those of you who have made a donation already to help Lit and Phil continue its good work. If you would like to make a donation and you haven't already, please do check our website for details how to do that, as well as our YouTube channel. So if there's nothing else to say for the moment, can I just bring the evening to an end, and thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye.